So let's start with this one. Viva, comrades, viva!
Viva!
Long live the revolution, long live!
Long live!
Long live corporations, long live!
Long live!
Long live Mwamko, long live!
Long live!
We'll rise for the limbo of our money. It is the anthem for the popular masses here in Africa. And now we have now adapted it as the popular anthem for the popular struggles in Kenya. So our feast on the
Somewhere. You want the left.
maybe we can do this. Yeah. Some people argue that we should put it on our hearts, but now let's do what we do. Our left is on our chest. Viva comrades, viva!
Viva!
Down with oppression, down.
Down!
Down with exploitation, down.
Down!
Down with capitalism, down.
Down!
Dead with capitalism, dead.
Yeah.
So we sing together. My Kenyan comrades together. And we have comrades from South Africa. Yeah. If we have comrades from anywhere in the continent like Gambia, you can sing in your dialect. So we go. Kupigwa na kupokonywa maisha hakutatuzuia sisi wananchi kunyakua uhuru wetu na haki ya jasho letu na haki ya jasho letu. Tumekataa kupiga magoti mbele ya hawa wauaji. Bila shaka sisi pia ni watu, hali ya utumwa tumeikataa, hali ya utumwa tumeikataa. Tutanyakua mashamba yetu, tupiganie uhuru wetu, tuikomboe elimu yetu, utamaduni na viwanda vyetu, utamaduni na viwanda vyetu. Sisi hatutaki kudhulumiwa, hatutaki tena mauaji, ili kupetu liangushe haki na uhuru zichanue, haki na uhuru zichanue. Uhuru wetu Wakenya, Wakenya, uhuru wetu Wakenya, tupiganie na mashamba yetu. Afrika, Afrika, mashamba yetu Afrika, tuzinyakue na mashujaa wetu. Afrika, Afrika, mashujaa wetu Afrika, tuwakumbuke. Ole yo!
some space because we are going to be moving today.
I think you did not inform people that you are saying we are guerrillas.
Are you not a guerrilla?
So you should move, and clap and dance and do stuff. Once again.
Mama. Mighty, mighty socialists.
We are the socialists.
We are the socialists.
Mighty, mighty socialists.
Mighty, mighty socialists.
Everybody go.
People wanna know who we are. So we are the communists. Mighty, mighty communists. We are the citizens. Mighty, mighty citizens. We are the men. Mighty, mighty men. Everybody go. People want to know who we are. So we are the communists. Mighty, mighty communists. We are the communists. Mighty, mighty communists. Everybody go. People want to know who we are. So we are the radicals. Mighty, mighty radicals. We are the radicals. Mighty, mighty radicals.
Everywhere we go, people wanna know who we are. So we tell them,
We are the socialists. Mighty, mighty socialists.
African women on the front line.
Organize, educate, liberate, celebrate. Away to
Revolution.
for the rights of the working class.
Revolution.
For the rights of the working class.
Viva!
Viva!
Before we sit, we need to make a declaration. We need to make a declaration so that we know where President Jackson is coming from. We know where Mwamko is coming from. We know where members of the social justice centers are coming from. So you repeat after me. My mother was a kitchen girl.
My mother was a kitchen girl.
My father was a garden boy.
My father was a garden boy.
That's why I'm a socialist. I'm a
Socialist. I'm a socialist.
We go together. 1, 2, go.
My mother was a kitchen girl. My father was a garden boy. That's why I'm a socialist. I'm a socialist. I'm a socialist.
President Jackson, who is there? Wait, who is there? Ah, is here. Ah, is here. No, she's busy. Are you a socialist, a communist? My mother was a kitchen girl.
My father was a garden boy. That's why I'm a socialist. I'm a socialist. I'm a socialist. My mother was a kitchen girl. My father was a garden boy. That's why I'm a socialist. I'm a socialist.
I am for the communist now. Hey, bye. Yeah. President Jackson is communist. Okay.
I'm gonna add.
All right.
So everybody can say, oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm doing my grandmother. My grandfather was a Pan-Africanist.
My grandma was a Pan-Africanist.
That's what's happening. My grandmother was a Pan-Africanist. That's why I'm a Pan-Africanist. I'm a Pan-Africanist. I'm a Pan-Africanist.
I'm
find out if you're
Okay, comrades. Viva, comrades, viva. So for the past 200 years, the communist movement has an anthem. And since some people don't know it, we will just do the so sing after us. Put your hand in your chest, raise your fist, and this is a very important anthem. So comrades, come riding, and the last fight let us sing. Internationally united human race, so comrades, come riding, and the last fight let us face the internationally unite the human race. Thank you very much.
have your water. Oh, I have your water. I really need it.
Greetings, comrades. Greetings. Greetings, everyone. Greetings, comrades.
Greetings.
My name is Supoyo, and I'll be moderating the discussions today and the program today. But before I start, maybe just to thank all of us for creating time to be part of this important discussion, for joining us, dealing with us today, and hopefully by the end of the day we leave this place more enriched than we got here. I'm a member of Mwamko, and Mwamko is co-organizing this event, this lecture by Comrade Kali with Cooperation Jackson. Mwamko is a Pan-African popular pedagogy collective, and so we engage in political education process, political education movement, with activists, and revolutionaries, and with communities. So before we begin the program, maybe just to give you a few logistical updates. Some of us might not know where the washrooms are, but if you go straight up this corridor, the first or second door on your left, no, this is right, on your right, yeah. First and second door on your right are washrooms. There is a male washroom and a female washroom, so you can decide which to use. I hope it's communicating here. It's left. Oh, okay, I was about to call it onto the stage. He's here. But as we begin today's program, feel free to feel at home. And I'd like to invite Daniel to tell us more about what brings us to this particular moment in time, and introduce Kali Akuno, who will be giving the lecture. Karibu kamaradi.
Viva comrades, viva. Very happy that we're here. So this lecture was as a lot of our things in this struggle upon us. There's an element of spontaneity, and there's also an element of course, organized sort of thought and intellect that we're going to read. Next week we will having a meeting, and we decided Kali is coming from Capital Justice, which is one of the most progressive movements in the world right now. So we decided, whilst our comrade is here, and Saki is also here for Capital Justice, we can hang out and have a lot of conversation, but how about we sort of... the two clips, yeah. Sorry. So we have like 4 people with us from America who, so like I was saying, before we could privatize or sort of seclude this conversation, we're like, why don't we have a deeper conversation? I mean, I was just talking to a lady at the cafe earlier, and she was talking to me about what is the alternative to this post-COVID world? What alternative economy are you talking about? Are you thinking about? What are you talking about in this? So I think I use it as a cue Kali is the co-executive director of Professor Jackson, and Saki is the head of operations. And then we have our two comrades here, also from Jackson. Yeah. So I will not take a lot of our time. We're talking today about Kali doing a lecture on solidarity on the age of globalized behavior. I know it's a mouthful, but I think Kali will break it down very nicely. Then we'll get the video. So, welcome, Kali. Should we get your seat? No. Okay. So welcome.
All right, well, I'm gonna have to reject because I guess we're doing this in part like live stream for folks back where we come from. But I'm one of these kind of people who, when I give talks and lectures, let me let you know off the top, I hate written notes. I hate PowerPoints. Primarily because I like to know a little bit about who I'm talking to first, to be able to have a conversation. So we're going to do a little bit of call and response just to give me primarily a way to be able to dialogue with you. All right? So this is what's called for me, a baseline activity.
So a couple of people online were asking about the volume. So even though you're going to walk around, can you focus on walking around?
So I have to stay around here is what you're telling me?
I mean, not, yeah.
Okay.
So I
All
would
right.
say
Well,
like here.
I won't be moving as much as I thought I would. All right. That said, I do want to ask, how many of you here, by just raise of hand, show of hand, how many of you here have heard of the social and solidarity economy? If you've heard of it, raise your hand. Okay. All right. How many of you here who raised your hands consider yourself a practitioner of the social and solidarity economy in any form or fashion? All right, so what that tells me is that before starting, we have to establish a baseline of what the hell we're talking about with folks here. So let me start off from the top relative to the subject. I'm here as somebody advocating for the development of the social and solidarity economy. So I want you to know that, to be clear about what my position is, where I'm coming from, so there's no ambiguity about that. So you know where I stand on a particular point. Now, having established that, there is this notion that the social and solidarity economy is kind of automatically an alternative to capitalism, right? It's automatically an alternative to the dominant economic system which exists. I want to make an argument off the top that that is an incorrect view of what the social and solidarity economy is. The social and solidarity economy, I will argue, can be something that's transformative and revolutionary, but in and of itself, it is not. So there are things that we have to interject in a very conscious and deliberate and intentional manner to make it a revolutionary set of practices, if that is where we choose to go with it. Now, you may want to adopt some of this, but not pursue a revolutionary goal and objective, right? That's your right, that's your, within your capacity to do. But first, let me explain, it's going to be brief, what we're talking about in terms of the social and solidarity economy. The thing that most people, I'll start with the things that most people are somewhat familiar with, I think from your experience, right? We can check that. How many people here have heard of cooperatives, workers' cooperatives, farmers' cooperatives? Okay. How many people here have heard of credit unions? How many people here have heard of alternative currencies? How many of you here are engaged in any of those three? Okay, so those are basic elements of the solidarity economy. There's a lot more, right? There's a lot more. There's community land trust, there's building commons, there's doing commoning, there's time swaps, there's time shares, there's a whole set of practices that are involved in what people call the social and solidarity economy. And what the commonality between all of these things are is that they try to distribute resources amongst their practitioners in an even and egalitarian way, right? So it's production for the sake of social investment and social sharing, not for the purpose of the private appropriation of wealth, meaning that you work for me, right? And whatever surplus comes from that, I appropriate it because I own and control the means of production. You just work for me. So the social and solidarity economy says that we should be doing farming on a maybe significant scale. We should be doing some level of industrial development on a significant scale. But that should not just all go to like Jeff Bezos, right? Or it should not all just go to Elon Musk as the sole kind of owners or proprietors of these particular activities, right? And we got to remember, Jeff Bezos don't actually sell no books, right? Elon Musk has never made a car in his life, right? He's never made a solar panel. He's never actually constructed one. He just owns a particular set of contracts which gives him the right to appropriate the labor of others that he just benefits from, right, in the form of a profit. So the solidarity economy is saying, like, we do all this work together, we do it all in a social manner, we should all benefit from it. Now, why, to establish that baseline, why I'm saying that is good, but why it's insufficient to get to where I think some of us want to go. And let me start off by just saying, many of us are already engaged in cooperatives, right? Many of us are already engaged in time banking or alternative currencies, credit unions. We're already doing that. By themselves, have they fundamentally transformed our lives? That's the question, right? I think some of us will say yes, but in an uneven manner. So if you work at a co-op, hopefully by working at the co-op, you are able to determine how many hours a day you work, what you produce. So you have more choice, you have more agency, but it hasn't directly eliminated you from having to even work for a wage, right? You're still a wage earner, but you're just earning wages primarily with people that you're working together with, and you're distributing that. And my point being is that in and of themselves, these solidarity economic institutions don't automatically take us out of capitalist social relations, right? They ameliorate some aspect of capitalist social practice. So instead of one person or a small group of people, like a group of shareholders appropriating all the wealth, it would go to you if you work at a co-op, right? Or if you work at a credit union, instead of excess fees being assessed again by a group of shareholders, it goes to the membership, right, which would be included. So it distributes wealth in a more equitable manner, but just distributing wealth in and of itself is not going to eliminate capitalist social relationships. And we need to be clear about that. So if we want to use this tool to try to get rid of those set of relationships, then we have to do them in a profoundly different manner. Now, the reason why I'm making this argument is that there's this kind of notion, as I was alluding to earlier, that by just adopting these practices, we're doing something outside of the capitalist norm. And I think that's a false notion, one that we need to dispel, right? Because that in itself is not necessarily an alternative. It may make a little things easier in our own personal lives, but it's not necessarily producing systemic change. And what we're trying to get to is systemic change, right? At least those of us who are trying to pursue a set of what we would call revolutionary objectives. But I want to talk about why this particular false notion is being put out there, right? And this is to open up a particular debate. So one of the reasons why there's I would say in the last 20 years, One of the reasons why there's been so much kind of this fanfare around the social and solidarity economy is because the left in general has been grasping at straws, right? And that we do not have a coherent strategy, and that our old strategies have been found to be somewhat ineffective at best. I'll be polite to us, right? Ineffective at best. Now, what do I mean by that? You know, for most of the 19th and 20th century, the primary objective was to what? Organize the working class, right? And have the working class basically seize the means of production at the sites that they worked at and transform society by the collective ownership of the seizure of the means of production. Now, only a few places that we even come close to that in the 20th century in particular. And often, a lot of, if we're being honest and truthful, a lot of the projects which claim to have done that actually didn't do that either, right? Most of the projects that have claimed to have done that had vanguard parties of one form or another, which seized the state and then seized the means of production from those who held it. Now, why am I making a distinction here? The primary thing was it was not the workers themselves in almost any of those examples which actually rose up and seized the means of production at the very points of production. That was few and far in between, right? So a lot of times what wound up happening is you had forces with well-meaning intentions from above, right? Appropriate from the expropriators, we would say. They kind of removed the capitalist class, but there was a missing element. The workers themselves did not have the knowledge, the skill, or the democratic habits to be able to actually function and manage the economy. So it wound up having to be largely directed from above, where quotas were set. Like, we need to make this many amount of shoes, we need to make this many amount of beds, we need to make this much amount of food like every year. And since that came from below, from above, it didn't often have the inputs from the folks who were actually doing the production about, well, what are the terms of conditions of the soil, right? What new tools and instruments do we need to make this productive, this growing activity more productive than what it is, right? So there was a tremendous knowledge gap because of how this transformation took place. And what I would argue for, this is where the social and solidarity economy does come in, is that at its best, learning how to manage a co-op, learning how to manage a timeshare, learning how to actually run like a real credit union. What that teaches all of us is how to be democratic subjects, right? And that's a critical piece, is the accumulation of this knowledge and these habits and these practices in a broad distributed way. Because what we often have in our movements, in this society in general, we have a profound uneven development within everything that we do. And we just need to own that. Like, if you were to come to Cooperation Jackson, you'll see a profound level of knowledge between like some of the primary practitioners and then those who are coming in. And I would argue, just from lived experience, almost any project you show me, there's going to be this level of uneven development. And that's not to say that the work is bad in any form or fashion. It's just a measure of how far we really have to go to get to where we claim that we want to get to, right? Where we want to be, right? And how much time and energy it actually takes to do that development. And what I know, because I'm a prisoner of this myself, how would you to phrase it, like trying to seize the current opportunities with the limited amount of forces that we have, that we're related to. So you're often in a situation where in reality, we're being adventurous at best, if we're really being honest with ourselves. Pursuing a set of objectives that we know we don't have the necessary forces to actually win or accomplish, but we can't let the opportunity go by. So we make do as best we can with what limited forces we can. But we know when we get to that critical point of achieving something, that gap of what you really have winds up becoming much more apparent, right? Because let's say, like, let me cite an example like in Jackson. So in Jackson, we were able, our movement, the movement that I come from, we were able to win the municipal elections. First, we won the city council seat, then we won the mayor seat. And for the left of the United States, that's not an insignificant achievement. But what became apparent is once we had office, most of our top cadre, if you want to call it that, let's be real, wind up going to work for the city, which means that the projects on the ground in the community were left with folks who were not sufficiently trained to actually make them continue or grow or thrive. And so we wind up being kind of captured within the state apparatus trying to make it function, while our actual objective work, the things that got us, to the place of being able to win the elections, wind up suffering, right, and becoming somewhat stagnant. And this is a process you see time and time again with, left forces of various stripes trying to seize a certain level or trying to attain a certain level of state power. And then once they attain it, what do we often see? Right? The criticism is they wind up losing connection with the base, right? They wind up abandoning the social movements. When in reality, most of the key leaders that were holding that together wind up going to the states. You automatically were going to make a disconnection, right? Because of the uneven development of our movement. So the critical piece here that I would argue is we need to be honest about what the social and solidarity economy is and what it can do in a period like now, right? And that requires us to really, I think, have a clear analysis of what this period that we're living in is, right? And this may be a part of a debate, and I'm definitely willing to engage in one with anybody. This particular period is one of open contestation around empire. That's the way I would frame it. Mm-hmm. Right? There's beginning to be an open contest. Now, what does that mean? That means the United States, I would still argue, is still a hegemonic force, but its potency as that force is rapidly declining. It's rapidly declining. Right? And if you look at the United States, fundamentally, it only has two primarily advantages over the rest of the world relative to a contest around resources, right? And who's going to manage the world's resources. So the United States' greatest advantage overall is still its military capacity, right? The United States has more weapons than all the rest of the world put together, if you were to add it up, right? And it spends more on its military year in, year out than all of the rest of the countries of the world combined. Right, so that is one tremendous kind of benefit it has to maintain a hegemonic position. The other one I would argue that it has is it controls most of the world's processes of financial management. Right, so if you want to do any fundamental exchange within your own country or across any kind of international border, you're largely following and being forced to adhere to processes that are regulated by some instrument of the United States government. And I include the IMF, the World Bank, and the United States as extensions of their fundamental power. So if you want to do any fundamental change or exchange currency, you're dealing with them and their institutions. That's all they really have, right? I think the third power is more of a soft power. It's cultural, right? The world consumes a bunch of American media. Right, and with that comes values, norms, perceptions, right? So that's the third kind of power that it has. But even that is in a decline, I would argue, right? But if you look at where the world is now, most of the actual production of goods and services is done elsewhere, right? China is now fundamentally the world's largest producers of goods, not necessarily of services, but of raw material goods, of commodities. And then we've been all hearing more about this fanfare about the BRICS. I'm not a fan of BRICS, but I recognize objectively what it is, right? For those of you who don't know what BRICS is, Brazil, Russia, India, China, right? It's economic, and South Africa. It's an alliance of these particular countries to do a level of economic planning and coordination. The greatest thing it seems to this point that they seem to try to coalesce is trying to find a way to de-dollarize the world's economy or make an alternative currency to challenge the U.S. dollars in the currency piece. They have not fully coordinated their production, and I doubt that they will get to a particular point in that regard, because in fact, two of the major players in that are actually rivals to each other. That's India and China. So there's an inherent contradiction that's within their own formation automatically that's going to keep them from doing some of the things that they claim that they want to do. But what is clear about this particular age is that the United States has definitely just launched another Cold War. That's been the case, I would argue, basically since 2000. But they've become much more clear and explicit about it, particularly the Biden administration has become much more clear and explicit about what they're trying to do and what they're setting out. And the rollout of this was earlier. So if you even go back and look at Obama, right, he articulated the strategy. If you never heard of this, I want you to look it up. Right, he articulated the strategy that was called the pivot to Asia. And it was fundamentally a military strategy, but it had profound economic components to it. Right, they were trying to create a whole East Asian new trade bloc that they were putting together, and then Trump came in right as that was about to get signed, canceled it, right? But the fundamental elements of it still fundamentally in place, right? The core pieces of it, not all the documents have been signed, but the core pieces of it are in place. But what they're very clearly doing right now is getting prepared for a war with China. So if we want to understand the age that we are in and what room that we all have to maneuver within our social movements, we're dealing with a world that's pivoting towards this great contest between the United States and its allies on the one hand and China and its allies on the other. Right? And those of us who are beholden to neither one, we find ourselves in this kind of liminal in-between space, oftentimes being forced with this false choice of you have to choose between one or the other. Right? Choose between one or the other. And where the solidarity economy arguments often come in is this notion that we can kind of create something on the margins of this conflict that is more grounded in our communities that doesn't necessarily have to be tied to this great context. Well, I want to argue with all of you that that's not true. That's not true. And one of the fundamental reasons why it's not true is despite the grand theory about how and what the solidarity economy can do, the reality of the solidarity economy is that it's still very much entrapped and ensnared in the very credit system, right, that this contest is really about. Now, what does that mean? So like within Cooperation Jackson, to make it practical, we very deliberately and intentionally try to do everything within our power to not take out a loan for anything, right? So when you come to Jackson and you see all the things that we own and are working on, right? We own all those things outright. We don't have any loan that we have to pay back to a bank or X, Y, and Z. And we've done, I think, within the U.S. context, we've done a fairly good job of being able to buy everything that we own, and we put that in the community land trust, right? So it's not privately held, it's organizationally held. But we're now at a space where we just run into a brick wall. And the brick wall is, the way that capitalism works, we took a depressed area, deeply depressed area, done a little bit of development in that depressed area, and what has it done? It's raised the value. Capital has now raised the value of the properties all around us and between where we live on the basis of what we did. So we didn't escape that relationship in any form or fashion, right? In order to think necessarily that we would, Because it was always, kind of a time game, right? Like Saki would tell you, I was always like, we better hurry up. We got like 5 years when we first started. I was saying we got 5 years to buy as much land as we can buy. And why I was saying that was like, we got this much amount of time before the forces of capital catch up to what we are doing, and then value and appreciate what's around us in a way that we didn't get priced out, given our access to capital. We are now at that brick wall where we're not completely priced out, but our ability to grow either in terms of acquiring more land. And for us, acquiring land is to try to decommodify. Let me say that, as much as possible, right? To try to decommodify, take it off the speculative market. But the issue is, in terms of now being able to build the affordable housing that we aspire to do, right? Build the eco-village type of process that we aspire to do. We now need more capital than we ourselves in our small community can access. So we either have to create some alternative means of financing ourselves, which we're pursuing, or we're going to have to try the traditional means. And the traditional means, we now have been subject to all the market pressures and forces that we've been trying to escape. And so I want us to understand that there are limits to what we can do outside of being connected to larger social movements that are striving to push a revolutionary agenda. And that's why just adopting these practices in and of themselves won't get you where you want to go. Because it's going to have to be tied to a broader set of forces that are pursuing, I would say, 3 particular objectives. If you want to really move in a revolutionary fashion, and this is where the consciousness really comes into it, right? If you're going to really do this to try to pursue, I would argue, a revolutionary agenda, you have to be clear that you're developing these social and solidarity institutions with the primary objective, some of the primary objectives of number 1, I would argue, you're trying to eliminate the private appropriation of the means of production. That's number 1, right, on a massive scale. Number 2, we're trying to make sure that wage labor is not the predominant way of organizing labor in our communities. That's not the primary way in which social relationships are structured. And then number 3, and I think this is a critical one and probably controversial, but number 3, we need to get to a place wherein commodity production is not the primary reason why we're producing goods and services, right? And if we're not clear about those particular things in our pursuit of this particular strategy and building an alternative, we're just going to wind up reproducing or replicating what already exists. But I would also on a weaker basis, right? Because one of the things that is also at least clear to us is that a lot of people pursue the solidarity economy because they do not actually have ties with the working class. At least I would say in the Western context, right? They do not actually have a relationship with the working class.
Say that one more time. In the same way?
No, so I mean, so in the United States, I'll speak to that. I think Europe is somewhat similar, but I would argue probably have some of these dynamics here on the continent as well, right? Mm-hmm. So most of us who are able to go to college, right, and receive some level of college training, education, let alone if you get a degree. Once you have that degree, the nature of the modern economy, right, particularly the United States, which is a service-oriented economy now, you're very limited to actually what profession you can actually go into, right? And so you're either going to teach in one form or fashion, or you're going to go work for some big corporation, or you're going to find somewhere in the United States into the third sector, which is the nonprofit sector.
NGO.
Right, the NGO. Those are your 3 primary options. And then your 4th one is what? You create your own enterprise.
Hustle.
Right? You create your own hustle, basically. Now, none of those put you in direct relationship to actual working people, right? On a mass level, in the way that the economy is structured. And so the way in particular co-ops are taught, I know at least in Europe and in the United States, it's largely taught with an entrepreneurial bent in mind, right? And that what you're doing is a certain level of job creation, right? And at best, the way it's approached to like Black and brown communities in the United States, you're actually just trying to serve a niche market, right? Where a particular set of goods and services are under provided for within your community, and you're to fill that gap. It's not posed as something that's actually challenging the mainstream, productive capacity. And at best, what a lot of folks will tell you is that what you're aiming to do is, in many respects, be a subservient to the dominant piece and just fill a particular niche to it. Like that is the orientation. There is no orientation around, like one of the things I've been arguing with Brother Chris Small whenever I have his ear, I don't want you to think about just creating a workers' union that's going to make conditions in Amazon better, right? I want you to think about making Amazon a co-op, right? Transform it, make it something that the workers own and control, and then you won't have to be as worried about automation as a particular influence of what that corporation is clearly intending to do, phase workers out of the entire process, right? Which is what Bezos, in fact, does have in mind, right? He makes no bones about that. But if we were to own and control it, right, then you can do appropriate technology, if you want to engage in that way, to be able to maintain the level of efficiency that Amazon has clearly gotten to. Like, we can't argue with its efficiency. I mean, it's a beast in terms of delivering products, at least in the United States, right? I can't speak about elsewhere. But how is it attained that is at a deep level of exploitation of its workers, right? Combined with a very efficient, on-time access to mass technology, right? Mass computation, and the whole reorganization of all the different means of distribution, from containerization to mass shipping, all those different things that it's kind of massive. We need to be thinking about, well, how do we articulate that and make it either a public good or public utility or something that's cooperatively owned? But how often do you hear the social and solidarity economy being framed in that particular way? Very often, right? Not very often, I would say, right? And then there's a way in which we're still in a way of thinking about the trade unions, in particular, just arguing for either more share of the pie or just better wages and working conditions. And that is not going to solve the problem or get us where we need to go. But a large part of how the solidarity economy is framed is because the trade union movement basically has been eviscerated in most countries. Right? I can only and to be real with you, in the United States, the trade union movement, its greatest asset now are its holdings in terms of its financial mechanisms, right? Like, they have more power in terms of the assets they manage over their members' pensions than they do actually at the point of production, right? Like, there's hardly any union right now in the United States, to give you an example, that can say, like, we're going to shut down all the Ford factories, for a week. That would largely be impossible in the United States. It's the way in which the unions are fragmented, the way the factories are fragmented over different states with different laws, different jurisdictions. That would almost be impossible. Where they have aggregate political power is, I can move this much money to a Democrat to support their campaign, as opposed to I can actually apply pressure at the job site. So we are articulating the solidarity economy in the face of that weakness, the weakness of the old 20th century, right? But we're not having an honest conversation about why some of us are choosing this route as opposed to some of the earlier routes and strategies of the 20th century. We need to close that gap. Because one of the things that we argue for in our context, in our country, or the country we reside in, we change their language, the country that we reside in, is that we are not going to build the transformative society we need unless there's a strong solidarity economy component combined with the old trade union movement. And that those two pieces have to come together to build a coherent and solid base of working class self-organization. Like without that, we're not going to move in any fundamental transformative way. It just won't go anywhere. But there is one particular thing, and I'll end with this. So one of the things from our experience and trying to generalize that experience, we put together this piece called the Build and Fight Formula, right? And what we're arguing for there is that we have to start organizing the working class through the activities that it is already doing, it's already engaged. And at least in our context, we can point to projects like mutual aid projects that exist everywhere in one form or fashion, right? We can point to folks who are doing different levels of food production, right? From community gardens to folks going back to the land. We can point to that everywhere in our context, right? We can point to people in all these new union organizing experiences from Starbucks to Target to Amazon. We can point to that. We can point to the solidarity economy work, forming cooperatives, all this stuff in our context that's growing. We can point to folks who are experimenting with digital fabrication, fab labs, maker spaces, all those different kind of things. We can point to millions of people who are involved in these activities. What we can't point to is to those folks being in any formal dialogue coherent with each other about creating a new society. But they can, those are the building blocks that we argue that could have the transformative potential to create a new egalitarian democratic society. But we have to figure out how we put all these forces in communication and in dialogue with each other. And so some of the things that we are ascribing that we think that help get us there is the adoption of people's assemblies in a broad manner. And then another piece that we've been grappling with that we're experimenting with hopefully all of you hear more about in the near future, is creating what we call a social digital infrastructure that creates the ability for us to do a level of dialoguing, value sharing, exchange, but also production planning with each other, right? And to do so utilizing, the technologies, the best of the technologies that exist that facilitate mass communication without necessarily having to be in, deliberative meetings for 10 and 12 hours that sometimes we have like our people's assemblies, right? But to be able to do this on a day-to-day basis, right, through these means of exchange. So we think that there is a road towards getting where we need to go, but it's going to require a different type of organizing than what we've done in the past to be able to get us there. And it has to start with the self-organized activities that millions of people are already doing, but be in dialogue with them about seeing what they're doing, not in isolation, that I'm just doing farming maybe for me and my small community, but can we do some exchange between what you're farming and what these folks are here over producing, whatever it may be, can we be in some dialogue around sharing and exchanging in that particular way on a coherent manner? And if we're doing that, then we're building an alternative, right? That's outside of having to rely upon the existing relationships that are within the predominant framework of the goods and services that you buy or receive either from the state or from the market as it presently exists. And it's only when we get to that level can you really argue that this is an alternative. Until then, we're engaging in practices which ameliorate the suffering of people, but that doesn't necessarily pose an alternative. And we need to be clear about that distinction. Like there's nothing wrong, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing about, we need to do everything we can to ease the pain and suffering of our people. Point blank, period. I'm not going to argue with anybody who's doing any kind of project that's doing that. But to think that just easing the suffering is transformative is a misconception, right? It has to be organized in a broad way, broad democratic lines, and it has to have some clear aims and objectives. So I'm going to stop there.
Can you make one point about the class? Can you make one point about the new thing?
Oh, so there's part of what we're doing in our, you'll often hear us in Cooperation Jackson, if you hear any of the lectures and stuff, talks I've given, or Saki or other folks, we often make a point that we don't do co-ops for co-op's sake. It's a co-op with a purpose. We're very clear about that. In our kind of objective. And there's strengths and weaknesses to our approach. Let me be clear about that, right? We've been doing this close to a decade, and one of the things that we've definitely kind of learned as a weakness to what we do is that we have designed our co-ops in accordance to kind of certain material objectives that we've said we need to make sure that we have a certain level of food sovereignty in our community. Why? Because food has been used as a weapon against us very deliberately and intentionally in Mississippi and Louisiana. Not in some past period, but in some recent periods, right? You can look at what happened after Hurricane Katrina as one of the key examples of how that was used as a weapon. So understanding that it's okay, well, we need to ramp up the autonomous food production that happens in our community to a level that we can, try to distribute enough food in our community through, solidarity and mutual aid relationships that we would, in the case of a crisis, we'd be able to feed our community and the community not have to be scattered, right? That's an aim and objective. We haven't gotten there, but that's an aim and objective. But having that aim and objective, we then said we want to make a priority of developing farms. Well, that means you're taking a bunch of folks who live in an urban environment who've never farmed in their life, right? And saying you're now going to become a farmer. And the weakness of that is sometimes I'm moving in accordance with a political objective, but that's not where my heart is, right? My heart is I want to be an artist, or my heart is I want to be or something in that effect, right? And so what happens with that is that people may work for a period of time, maybe 2 or 3 years, but eventually they want to go pursue with their heart and desire. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just that we have to we just are recognizing through our experience what the limitation of how we do co-ops is, right? Because the way most co-ops are done is through, at least in the United States, through entrepreneurial leaders, is you find a bunch of people who share a common interest, right? Whatever their interest may be, they work on developing a business plan and a business operation, they go out and create their co-op. Now that may be fine for those particular members, but in a community like ours, you can have a great artist co-op. We got a bunch of great artists, right? But you can have all the art still be starving, right? And that's the point that we're trying to make. Like, we need to make sure that we're not dependent upon Walmart for our food. That's a political objective. So ours is very much tied to that. And what we've been trying to argue is that in the broader sense in the movement, that we want to build what we call like class conscious cooperatives, right? As a means of correcting some of the articulation of how these co-ops work. There's another thing about co-ops, at least in the United States. Truth be told, a lot of co-ops occupy certain types of niches. There was a great run from the 70s, basically through the early 2000s. We had all these food co-ops that emerged all throughout the United States, right? And they're particularly focused in on healthy foods, right? Organic food, that's the word I was looking for, organic food. Well, there wound up being a problem with that. The organic food was often far too pricey and too expensive than what most, at least Black working class people could afford. So they were moving these food co-ops into like poor, economically depressed communities. Sell food that most folks couldn't afford. The value of the property that they had, that they owned, would skyrocket, forcing more Black people to be moved out of the community. So they became forces of gentrification. Quite often the opposite of what they were intending to do. But oftentimes they didn't think about, well, what is the larger overall impact, social impact of what my activity may be, right? Because that, in one, oftentimes these were largely white folks who came in and kind of developed these. So there was an absence of a race conscious and there was an absence of a class conscious, right? So you need to have both, right? And also a gender consciousness. Like you got to have all of those elements to be able to truly understand and be like, if I'm doing this, what might be the social impact of it, right? And what is the desired social impact of it? And so we're trying to interject this particular as an argument of saying if we don't build our cooperatives with these kind of intentionality in mind, we'll wind up creating kind of a sort of being prisoners to larger market forces, the dynamics which are outside of our control, which will actually make conditions in our communities even worse. Right, so that's a particular piece that we are trying to make an intervention in, at least in the U.S. space, because right now co-ops are kind of like a social rage in the social movement space in the United States. Right? It's grown over time, right? And the way in which some of it is growing is repeating a lot of the dynamics of the mistakes of the past, right? In that the activities are not being viewed as political in themselves, and the way in which they're framed is just like an economic frame, not necessarily a social justice frame, right? Or the social justice frames are framed in such a way that the market is going to make things better for the people in our communities. And I can tell you, as an African living in the United States, the market ain't never been good to us, right? In no form or fashion. So, and often we've been subject or prisoners or commodities on that market, literal commodities on that market. So this is a clear piece that we're trying to articulate and fight for folks to be clear about understanding what they're doing, why they're doing it, what they're hoping to accomplish. So I'll stop there because I know there's supposed to be a panel, and then no, it's question and answers first, right?
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Harry. So fantastic to be speaking. Happy and it's such a good thing. So I basically have it's a question, but I'm also trying to think. And I'm thinking about, I mean, you're talking specifically about socialist solidarity economy, but I want us to maybe take a step back. Because a lot of where some of us are, we haven't even gotten to a solidarity economy. We're at the level of mutual aid. And in the last, especially since the pandemic began in 2020, in many feminist circles, in many, I guess, those of us who are re-engaging with socialist ideas, I mean, this is a country where we last had a proper Marxist socialist communist movement in the 80s, and now we are seeing a resurgence. The possibilities of that's another question altogether. So, I mean, you talk about the limitations of doing this work, one within a capitalist framework, which, of course, unfortunately, we all find ourselves in. We are not in a Marxist utopia, even using utopia as a problem. We're not in a communist world yet. We all find ourselves organizing within a deeply, deeply capitalist, fascist space at this particular moment. So what would you tell people engaging around mutual aid? Because you've said, I mean, you say, and I agree personally, that alleviating the suffering is not enough, but at the same time, there's so much suffering, and there's an argument to be made about people just need a little bit of hope and a little bit of stitching together in order to be able to struggle for the long haul. So maybe could you speak to that? One, I'd love to hear a bit more critiques about mutual aid as it stands at present, but also how do we make that leap from just, and I don't want to call mutual aid banding because it's not banding. Many people's lives have been rescued literally with the kinds of mutual aid that has been available, and it's also offered very many people an entry point into more collective organizing and thinking about society. So one, I'd love to hear a bit more critiques if they are. I'd like to take them back to the spaces that I'm in, but also how do you bridge that from moving from, we care for each other. The 5 of us, the 10 of us are going to figure out how to pay someone's rent, how to ensure that someone has food, how to get someone out of prison, which the social justice working group and movements in this country have been able to do. So how do we move from the 5 of us, the 10 of us, into actually thinking about the mechanisms and the mechanics and the tools around thinking about it within a more structural and systemic form to take down the system of capitalism, patriarchy, fascism, whatever there is. So how do we sort of, that whole bridge, basically?
Can I start with one piece?
As you wish.
The neighborhood that we went to, we were able to go to a neighborhood yesterday. Uhuru. And I'm bringing that up because I think there's a way in which people analyze the social and solidarity economy as formally registered activities, as opposed to the organic activities that people do to survive. So you said that there's not much of a solidarity economy here, part of what you said, right?
No.
Cooperative, were you saying cooperative or solidarity economy?
I mean, roots of solidarity are actually very African.
Right.
Solidarity
Okay.
is an exceedingly African thing. I mean, if I don't have salt, I'm definitely gonna get salt from my neighbor. So the idea of solidarity, even with capitalism, colonialism, neoliberalism, still exists. What I'm talking about is going beyond, I can get salt from you, and thinking about why don't people have salt? Why don't people have food? Why are children not able to access education? So thinking about it in a more systemic and sort of removing it. I mean, at the very base, that's important. But if we don't think about how to, I mean, at the end of the day, it's about power. So that's what basically the question is, how do we capture power? How do we think about power? How do we organize for power rather than alleviation of pain and harm?
Well, all right, so one thing I would say, we got this, it's not a criticism of mutual aid, but it's a recognition of the limitations of it. The greatest weakness around most of our mutual aid work is that it's only distributing what exists, right? And because it's not tied to productive activities, because we don't own the means of production, let's be clear, because it's not tied to productive activities, we're distributing, a limited amount of time, energy, and resources amongst ourselves. Now, where our mutual aid practices are, I think, at their most advanced, are when we can create formal democratic decision-making processes that extend the mutual aid beyond our immediate relations into a broader communal relation. So if you're only distributing if you only have a little bit amount, like citing this community, like part of what they're doing with like the alternative currency, if you want to call it that they're doing a lot more, that they're using it. It was very clear yesterday from here that folks are doing banking with it and a bunch of creative stuff just that they've come up with. But the element that's the transformative element there that I see from my own perspective is that it's moved from the informal, right? And to be like, I trade with my neighbor, or I trade with my cousin, or, we do this, as opposed to we're creating a process that I may never know you, maybe never encounter you, but I'm now in some relationship with you through the instruments that we've created, that we can extend this solidarity to distribute goods and services amongst each other. So we have to develop, I would argue, we have to, in all of our communities at that base level, and if you look at the build and fight formula, mutual aid is at the first tier of it, right? And why is that the first tier? Because that's something that we all do already, and it's something all of us are going to be doing no matter what sort of form of society that we are in. It's a base level that we can all start with, regardless of what we have. But the trick is, and the challenge is, how do we create these formal structures so that it extends beyond our line of sight, and we can create a set of relationships with everybody in this room, if that we're limited to, whether we know each other, whether we like each other, whether we have the same political views or not. We are now in a new set of relationships because of the formal instruments we created, that we can distribute the goods and services amongst us in a more broader, equitable manner to meet the needs. So there's a formal introduction of tools and techniques that are needed, that I think the best practitioners of the solidarity economy can and should be coming into any community and introducing, right? But if you have to be clear, that will, and I love the way that they were framing it yesterday. Like they said that some of their objectives, at least the two groups that we met with, they were very clear about they wanted better health outcomes for their community, right? And they were dealing with like sanitation. Both of them were like emergency response, had some form in their name and objective. So like, we're going to eliminate cholera. We're going to do all these different things, through this mutual. And then they pointed to both subjective and objective things that you can measure. What I mean by objective here, that you can say, hey, we've produced these better outcomes by introducing these practices, right? The limitation is, going back to what I'm saying, recognize the limitation is, if there is no program I would argue, that takes this new level of solidarity and extends it to some productive activities, a broader set of productive activities that they can control, own and control, they'll be limited. So they improve their condition, but that has a cap, has a ceiling to it, right? And the piece that was, just me as an outsider, looking at it, similar to the community I grew up in to a certain extent, where if there wasn't solidarity, people wouldn't survive. That was just, it just wouldn't have happened. A lot of people would have been starving or been in prison, etc. But the thing that was real intriguing to me was just hearing what all the different people were doing. It was a broad range of productive activities. People, we to the really was there was a woman who owns a shop that makes soaps, and she sells soaps. She brought a collective group of people together to make some soap. They did a demonstration, but people were talking about all the different things they do. I was sitting there saying, like, okay, if we want to put this in theoretical terms, those of us who consider ourselves Marxists in some form or fashion, at least went through some school of training in that regard, this is the associated community of producers, right here, right? Not in some abstract world, right here. Now, how do we aggregate their economic activities and their political power to extend beyond that particular neighborhood to access more resources? So there's a political struggle that would then have to be waged, and then that's where a certain level of political organizing, to me, would need to come in to be like, how do we build consensus around we're going to pursue a broader set of objectives to access more resources outside of our community? What types of threats would we come under? Because, I'm sure in a context like Kenya, like in Jackson, the second you step out of your circle, you're messing with somebody else's pie, they're going to come fight with you. So be clear about, do we want to take that risk? If we're going to take that risk, what type of security measures do we need to set up? What type of communication methods do we need to set up? How does that relate to like the state? How is it going to impact? More likely it's going to favor the bigger market force than us. So how do we insulate ourselves around that? So that next step requires a certain level. There's a technical side of it, but then there's an organizing political side of it. How do you take the solidarity, and then you have to move to a level of conversation about, we don't also have to believe in all the same things, right? So I'm a Marxist, but that don't mean you have to be a Marxist to get down with me. And we now want to take our community, pursue a set of political objectives, like we want to buy more farmland, we want to buy a small, a shop somewhere to create a new factory or something like that, or a warehouse. We don't have to believe in all the same to pursue those political objectives, but we need to be united enough to be able to defend them, right, and understand their use. There's a level of political organizing that then has to be created and introduced. So that would be in part a short answer in a very practical term to part of what you're saying. But if you don't recognize, what I often hear a lot of the particularly more anarchistic folks, at least in the United States, is there's this argument that mutual aid is going to solve everything. It's like, no, it's not. If we're not engaged in actual productive activities, own and control the means of production at some point, like that means that we're just constantly stealing from those who produce, and we're constantly in a state where we're not changing things, where we're constantly going to be a subject to state prosecution.
My mom, you see, one way to make a big revolution is by measuring Africans that wages are not the damn way to just this socialist thing, this socialist movement. But I have to go from that I'm a product of that. My mom was not a maid or something, my father was not a gardener or something. My mom and my dad were product of Indians. They work for Indians. They receive wages for me to get a good education, at least, a good education for that. Those who, their fathers who were maids and gardeners and all that, they didn't get all that. They didn't get a good education. Some of them they didn't even make high school. But at least me, I got there, But I have this one question. I'm not a big part of this movement, but from now on, I am, because I'm getting in deep. I'm getting in deep, and I'm learning more about this. I've been learning it through books. I've been studying through books, but I'm getting to know more about socialism. But I have a big question: how can we show, like Kenyans, we're Democrats? Eh? We have two big families or three families that are running Kenya, and they're showing us that this is the way, that they own like three-quarters of the country. Eh? My big question is like, how can we change, how can we bring this socialist movement and show them this is the way, this is the right way, and telling them that wages, how can we sabotage wages, yet these guys have bills to pay, they're poor, and the only job they're getting wages, and they are satisfied with that. They don't want more. I worked for an Indian for like 6 years, and I was fired just because I fought for my right. I said, no, enough of this shit. I'm sorry for this. I'm sorry for using all of that word. I'm a nigga, I'm a black guy, yeah? But I mean, nitasema kama mimi, yeah? I'm a Kenyan, yeah? I'm just doing it real. Like, speaking out your mind, you get fired for that. Speaking out for others, you get fired for that. That is democracy. That is Kenya. That is Africa. That is one thing they won't tell you.
No,
That is one other thing.
that's universal, brother.
Yeah, that is
That's
one
not just
thing.
you.
That is another thing that, this movement, sometimes back, such movements, you started these kind of movements, you get arrested, you get killed or detained, something like that, yeah? So my question is this. My question is this. How can we get Kenyans to this socialist movement and telling them, like you said about wages, something about wages, yeah? How can we show them that accepting wages, they should not accept it? Like, how can we make change out of this? Like, tunaweza make active. No, how can we make it active? Like, how can we make it work and become equally good to Kayo?
Well, so let me clarify what I was saying about wages, if I can. Because the reality of it is, if you go start a co-op today, right, and your co-op is successful, right? Let's say 5 years from now, your co-op is successful. The reality is you're still going to be paying wages, right? To yourselves and to the people that work in the co-ops. So don't get it twisted that I'm saying that you just go automatically get rid of wages and wage labor immediately. That's not going to happen. I'm not here to say, bag of goods, right? That's not going to happen. What I was articulating is, by building a co-op, be clear that if that's a political objective that you want, your own co-op is not going to be able to do that by itself. You have to team up with other co-ops, and they're going to have to team up with other co-ops. They're going to then have to, tie into the mutual aid and the mutual credit. They're going to have to tie into all these different things, these other instruments of the solidarity economy, so that you can fundamentally start off, you're going to have to create an alternative, right? And so, similar to the community that we went to yesterday, they have the system that they're employing. One element of it, they have their own internal currency, but their currency is exchangeable with the shilling, right? And that's a transitional form that you're going to have to pursue, right? By building out this kind of broader network. But this network has to have the objective of mind of, we are trying to eliminate wages, we're trying to eliminate commodity production, and we're trying to get to a place. And the piece why that third one is important that I did interject. Why that's important is because you're trying to eliminate all the waste that capitalism produces, right? Commodities automatically result in a tremendous amount of waste. But producing for a need, right, rather than just producing for the market, helps to eliminate some of that waste. But you're only going to have to do that, you're only going to get rid of wages through a long, protracted struggle of democratizing the economy wherever you're at. So that moves it on the theoretical level. Now, I'm not going to try to answer for Kenyans what Kenya should do, right? I believe in self-determination. And, you know, it would be similar to you coming to my neighborhood without knowing a damn thing about my neighborhood, trying to tell me how things are gonna change here. That ain't gonna work, right? So I don't know enough about your situation. I'm a student of it, right? But I don't know enough about your situation to be like, well, do X, Y, and Z. What I can do, and what I'm trying to give an example is, there's some things I see, right, that are pretty powerful, where there is an objective basis for more to grow and develop that can and should be tapped into and extended in the Kenyan context to help move certain objectives. That I will point you to. But the piece around how you gonna raise consciousness and all those different things, those are things y'all gonna have to figure out. I can't answer that for you.
Okay, so I know Sulu is actually facilitating. Can I add like 3 more?
Maybe 2
One
more.
sentence.
Okay.
One sentence. I would be lying if I say 3 more words. The other point of what he's saying, and the key important part, and why we're looking at like cooperatives as an example, is the democratic management and the democratic stewardship of your labor, right? And so that part is like the second part to what he said. And for us, our understanding is when we are and when people are able to engage in an economy where that is happening, the democracy and the participation of people doing it in that way helps to build the muscle and the agency for that to impact other parts of their lives, right? And so being able to be in a worker self-managed company and have to practice interacting and debating and democratically, collectively managing it so that it's successful can also strengthen how that works in the political sphere, right? And that supports how the organizing and the I'll say organizing for now, like, or the people who aren't even actively engaged, right? Who may be in this position doing this work in terms of their livelihood, now can look at practically, how does that work? How I don't see it happening with my government on any level. And I'm in a position where, because of experience, I want to do that more, right? And so there's a small amount of us who are talking about how the state acts and how it needs to be eliminated, or maybe that's me. And for us, we see our theory of change as being this circle of the economy part is going to impact and increase and help us to build a more mass-based movement in the political area. Does that make sense? Okay. So I wanted to make sure that that point got made while we're talking about, like, how does this cooperative stuff work?
So we're talking this soon, but we're gonna take 2 more questions just for me. Back to back, I'll answer those and then we're gonna move to the panel. Cool? So the brother in the back and then the brother in the other. Sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
My name is Anthony. Just to ask us a learning question. According to what I've heard you saying here, I haven't heard about religion, and I think it's a very key factor in a creation of a dominating frame in individuals and even in the state organizing. Like for instance here, even our president believed that he prayed. He prayed and he became a president. Even us, there is this perspective of relating our economic condition with our faith. Like even there is this, people take their political material condition as a natural thunderstorm. How can we do about this?
I don't understand about natural thunderstorm. Yeah, that's big. Thank you very much. My name is Gesheke. I'm from Madare Social Justice Center, which is a community based in Madare, also with some, we would very much want to learn from Mukuru where we visited. But my question is this, you said about the political power. You went into political power, political space, and you forgot about the solidarity economy. How did you go to political power? What was the political vehicle? And Corporation Junction, does it have a political party that sponsor candidates to go to political power? And how is your politics organized? Because there is a major crisis in this country. Because of prevalence of NGO, we are more depoliticized, and now we are getting there. We like the idea of the political solidarity economy. That's very powerful, and I think that's somewhere we are moving as we continue building our social movement. And I think this opportunity for us to continue learning together. And I'm happy that our colleagues from Mwamko convened this meeting. But I would want to know about that question of the how did you go to political power, political space?
Mine is a comment to him, and maybe how you can approach that is first to understand that faith is a failed epistemology. So maybe an open definition of faith, which is not sort of popular, and it's faith as pretending to know things you don't know. So if you pretend to know things you don't know, that is where you will tend to sort of see patterns where none exist. And that is why maybe they are offering such explanations as to why things are happening a certain way, why I'm getting certain outcomes. So it all comes to the sort of the process of knowing. So if you use a failed epistemology, definitely the conclusions you are going to come to are going to be sort of false. So it's fixing the epistemology, how you come to know, how you generate knowledge, and then these other things will follow. And I will point this out because we live in a nation that is sort of, you will say many people are deists, and if you are trying to engage that, and I'm going to tie it to what you have asked him, one way you can be able to sort of disabuse people of that way of knowing, that sort of, that type of reasoning, is to use Socratic questioning. So that will get someone to a situation where they realize that they hold a position not because the claim they hold to be true is in proportion to the evidence, but it's because of other reasons. And once they get to that point where they see that this kind of getting to truth is sort of effective, then probably they will seek a better way of getting to the truth. And by thus doing, they will sort of emancipate themselves. But I know there are many sort of hindrances to sort of achieving that. And that state is sort of called exhaustive openness, where you are open to changing your mind based on more compelling arguments and maybe encountering evidence and appreciate sort of being one with the new evidence instead of sort of trying to shun which sort of goes against that which you believe to be true. So it's getting people from a state of doxastic closure where people sort of use faith to a state of doxastic openness where sort of they are receptive to better arguments and evidence. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Khalid, you have one last question.
Hi, my name is mine is not just a question. Thank you for being very honest. I think this is one of the hardest conversations we sometimes try to have and we end up not having. When you talked about fight and build, and I thought about one of the reasons why at some point we are not really in touch with the people,
because you're always fighting and not building bases and not guarding spaces that we already have. And so when you are in a situation like ours where people are in despair and people are in constant survival, if you're always fighting, and as Nyambura said, there's no hope, there's no space to catch a breath, then it looks like a mirage or a utopia that we can only think about, but uh, we can't reach to. And it's something as the Ecological Justice Collective we have struggled with and we have experimented, because we were thinking, fine, we want to go to town, petition, and demonstrate that Uhuru Park, Karura, and other places be protected. But where we come from, people don't have access to Uhuru Park or Karura. Where we come from, children don't have spaces to play. Where we come from, people don't have places to eat, don't have food, which is also very important. And I have learned the past 2 weeks I've been in the rural area trying to understand what women and farmers are doing with the food cooperatives that you're talking about. And there's that lesson which we are also picking, that we cannot fight if we don't sort out our food question. We cannot fight if we are hungry. And if you look at what almost sabotaged the revolutions that have happened in the past, it was the hunger and the famine. So for me, what I got from the fight and build is that we have to be very deliberate about where are we going to get what we eat, because we can't fight if we are hungry. And how are we guarding spaces that we already have, and that as we fight, we build. And we have seen this year, most of the events that we have done it in spaces that we have reclaimed. So if we were just fighting and not building, then we would have been in a place of even more despair, for lack of a better term, because you're fighting, but you don't have a space to retreat back to. I hope I made sense.
So let me try to be brief. Thank you for that. About a couple of different questions I've asked. I want to go back to your question, brother. So let me state it this way. From the people I come from, if they didn't have a certain degree of faith, I wouldn't be here talking to them. It was a degree of faith which kept them believing that they shouldn't commit suicide to end their enslavement, and that the future would be better. So I'm not going to argue with somebody's particular faith, but I do want to put in the context around how religion is being used in this particular era.
Yeah.
So when you said that I didn't speak to it directly about the nature of the period, but the right has made religion a very effective tool politically. And that's very intentional and very deliberate. I can't cite examples here, but I can tell you very clearly, maybe another conversation, about how capital fostered the development of right-wing Christian forces in the United States to be used as a tool against the working class movement. That was deliberate and intentional and paid for, right? As a very explicit thing of like, how can we distract the masses of people from looking at their own self-interest and looking at it in a collective way? We live in an era right now where the right is using and wielding religion extremely successfully right now. Because, and primarily, the left is not coming up with the questions on how we're going to actually make the material aspect of our society better. That's a space we've been removed from any form of dialogue, and the examples that we could cite are not necessarily the ones that are most attractive to the vast majority of people. And we need to be honest about that, right? And so what I tell people, like, look, We need to be honest about the Soviet Union. I'm glad it existed. I'm glad that that experience happened, right? But it did not go according to plan, right? That did not play out as theoreticians kind of believed and articulated for a whole bunch of reasons, right? But we need to have an honest conversation with folks about this is where it succeeded and some of the things that it tried to pursue, and this is where it failed. And then we need to come up with clear answers as to what in its failures, what are some of the correctives we are now introducing that are going to make sure that the next time around the left really tries to do something is going to be democratic and not, authoritarian. I don't like that word, but I'm going to just use it in this context, right? Because that was one of the failures of it. And the right, you have the Islamic right, you got the Christian right, you got the Hindu right, you got the Jewish right. All of them are fundamentally in every single society you can point to pretty much in control of state power, either directly or indirectly. Right? From India with Modi, right? To Netanyahu or wherever the hell they put up with up in Israel, all of them are to the right these days. Biden is fundamentally a right character. Don't think he's not. And from what I know about the characters that's running around here, all of them are fundamentally to the right. And all of them use religion as a primary political tool. But it's a tool of being able to capture the masses because there is no other alternative being articulated out there that's going to resolve the issues of how folks deal with their material needs here. And when you're not trying to resolve those, you come up with I can resolve it for you in the afterlife, right? And I can promise you that better by being more more pious whatever situation is. So I'm saying all this to say that I think it is our task not to argue with people's faith, but to point out the political contradictions that are being employed in the politics around how your religion is being used, right, to subject different people and restrict people from rights. And everywhere you look at how the religious right is being constructed, it's an anti-democratic project. Point blank, right? It's either we're going to exclude Muslims from doing something, or we're going to exclude Jews from doing something, right? Or whatever the situation is. So the left needs to be very clear about
Queer people.
About queer people. We need to be very clear about where we are relative to those two questions that don't conflict, right? Because I'm not opposed to somebody, if somebody wanted to start a meeting with a prayer, I would personally be opposed to that. But I would have a problem with using your religion to describe to somebody what their sexuality should be or whatever. Then we're gonna have a fight, right? But you just saying I want to, bless you with my understanding of how energy manifests in the world. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think any of us should, right? But it's just where it becomes political. That's the issue. Now on your question, unfortunately, our movement has had a number of splits around that very question that you asked. And that is how do you create the political instrument, right? The movement that I come out of, the New African Independence Movement, for a long time, we did not engage in the electoral politics of the United States empire, that's what we call it. We just didn't do it. And the primary reason was, why reinforce their structure? Why reinforce, their empire by interjecting in this politics? We made a compromise, and I'm one of the people who's guilty of this. I was one of the primary people who pushed it. We made a compromise and said, well, in a place like Jackson is 80% black, right?